Good morning. So, ladies and gentlemen, this lecture this morning will be the final piece of the theoretical puzzle on pricing, and this will allow us to proceed on this morning, next step in talking about economic calculation, and then we'll get to capital theory and business cycles and all the more advanced topics in Austrian economics. So yesterday we at least gave you some exposition of the theory of pricing of goods and services, and then Dr. Sandy Klein explained how economic theory gives the analysis of the price of money. And there, the concept of the purchasing power of money, like the price of anything else that we talked about yesterday, is what in finance we might call a spot price, or what Murray Rothbard liked to call a cash transaction price. It's just both parties are fulfilling their obligation under the contract immediately in the present, right? You go to the gas station, you pay for gas, and you get the gas, and you give the money. And so we were talking about prices only in that particular context. And what we want to do this morning is introduce into this discussion about pricing the element of time. So we can think of it this way, or we can label things this way. We could talk about the price of money in two different time frames. One, the purchasing power of money is timeless, right? It's just this mutually advantageous trade that's continuously taking place, as we buy things and the seller's selling things and we're transacting. We have a purchasing power of money. The other is the intertemporal price of money. And this is, of course, the rate of interest. This is when people trade, one party trades money sooner, fulfills the contract sooner, the lender, and then the borrower pays back the money later, right? And the interest rate is the price when this intertemporal trade occurs using money. And hopefully you can see right away that this is necessary to complete the whole logical structure of economic calculation, because entrepreneurs are using economic calculation to make investments in long-term projects or longer-term projects where they're not going to receive the revenue until the future, or a stream of revenue over time out into the future, and yet they're fronting the money. And so they're going to take into account what the intertemporal price of money is, and so that's where we're headed with all of this. Now we'll proceed in three steps. First, we want to talk about just a few fundamental points to finish up our foundational groundwork that we started with yesterday. And then we'll talk about two ways that are logically necessary for people, for you and I, persons engaged in valuing our actions with respect to time. There are two independent, separate valuations that we do. And so we'll, again, rehearse this with respect to the personal economy. And then with all of this in mind, we can launch into the nuts and bolts of the theory of interest. All right, so yesterday, remember, we talked about how because we're beings that are finite, that is, we have ends that we wish to fulfill, but just wishing to fulfill them doesn't fulfill them. We have to actually act, identify means and acquire them and engage in action, and think about the way in which we're combining things and choosing one thing and setting aside another. So this whole notion of scarcity and everything then that follows logically from that. And what we want to integrate into that discussion this morning is the fact that we're temporal beings. So all of our action takes place in time. And it makes sense then, before you think this out even, it makes some sense that we would pay attention to the intertemporal dimension of our action. So as finite beings, we distinguish between ends and means, and we have the scarcity of means and all the logic that follows from that. And as Mises puts it, as temporal beings, we distinguish between sooner and later. And because we distinguish between sooner and later, well, then there's an intertemporal logic, right, in action. Our valuations, in other words, have to extend to the intertemporal structure of action. And so that's where we want to focus. Now, in particular, what this entails is that action always involves a sequence of steps, or in capital theory, we call this stages, right? A sequence of actions are taken in order to produce first the good, the consumer good, and then to take the consumer good and engage in acts of consumption with the consumer good. So at the moment we decide to engage in an action, we can only anticipate what the realization of the end will be, because we haven't taken the steps yet that are involved in the sequence that's necessary, or that we choose at least, out of the possible technical possibilities that are available to us in our circumstances. We choose some particular sequence of steps to eventually get the satisfaction of consumption. Now, Dr. Peter Klein yesterday talked about the implications of this for entrepreneurship. So you're already familiar to some degree with the field that we're going to cover. Every time we make a decision to start an action, we can only anticipate or forecast or predict, however you want to say this, the actual attainment of the end that we're aiming at. We don't know this through our own experience at the moment we decide on a course of action. Now, we want to focus, though, today on a different element of this. And this is what Mises calls the duration of an action. So as he points out, every action is set in a time frame where there's the time before the action takes place, and then we start the action, and then we've designed it to occur for a certain duration, the time during the action, and then we complete the action, and there's time after the action. And the reason to point this out is not just to rehearse some technical fact of human action, but to notice that the duration of the action is a choice variable. When we think about how we're going to pursue some particular end and choose it over another, we're taking into account also this very element of time. It isn't just, oh, I've got means and I'm going to apply them and get an end. It's that if I use means this way, the duration of my action is extended in time, and if I use means this way, I have a shorter duration. And we can also, of course, decide when to start an action and when to stop it. And so that's where the valuation element comes in, and interest as a consequence of that. So there are two parts to the duration of any action. The first Mises calls the period of production, the time from the start of the action to the beginning of the attainment of the end. And this can be subdivided into working time, or stages of production that we mentioned before, and maturing time. I mentioned yesterday in talking about my own personal economy, well, my wife and I have a shared personal economy. I hope you enjoy this blessing of this yourself someday. But in any case, so I cut firewood. I mentioned this example. So there's this working time. It takes me 6 hours or whatever to cut the tree and to split it up into firewood. But then once I split it up into firewood, it has to sit there for a year. There's maturing time. You can't burn it. It's wet and it ruins the stove. You have to let it dry out. And then you have a meter that you use to test to see it's dry enough to use right? There's maturing time. Before it becomes, I already know this. I already know this when I'm engaged in the production process. I'm already anticipating this. So this is the idea. And then once the period of production is finished, well, then we can engage in the usefulness of the good that we produce for consumption. Get the firewood, put it into the wood stove, stay nice and toasty warm in the wintertime as my wife and I enjoy the evening. So this is the idea of the division here. Now, the duration of serviceableness too has a time element to it. So we can choose to produce consumer goods that are more or less durable. Sometimes a consumer good, of course, is perishable, right? Pick an apple off the apple tree in our backyard and eat it, and it's one service it renders in consumption and it's over. But others have different durations of serviceableness. And this too is a choice variable. We can produce products that have longer durations, they're higher quality, or however we would think about this, or of shorter duration. Okay, so next step. This is what I mentioned. We're going to concentrate a little bit on the two valuations of action with respect to time. Now that we see the conceptual framework proper framework for thinking about this. The first is what Joe Salerno likes to call time placement. So this is the first way that we value an action with respect to time. And on the timeline, what I'm illustrating here is we have a given action, and we could start it at, say, on the left-hand side where it says start. Maybe that's Monday morning, and we're doing this action over the morning of Monday. And the second, further to the right, the second start would be, instead of doing it Monday, we do it Tuesday. That's the idea, right? We could choose. For most actions, we're able to choose when to take the action, right? When to start, when to stop, what the duration is. This is time placement. And as Mises points out, Mises, recommend to you all to read very carefully, maybe even over and over again, Human Action. It's quite a remarkable book. And felicitous phrases that he uses. And one of the great ones in the section on time is that time is an irreversible flux. And what he means by that is time is not just like an hour that's homogeneous with every other hour, or a day that's homogeneous with every other day. Quite the contrary. Every hour that passes through the day and every day that passes through the week and so on and so forth presents a different, at least in principle, different circumstances for acting. And because it does, it means that the value of taking a particular action can be influenced by the moment we start and the moment we stop, because the marginal utility of the consumptive gain that we're going to get from that action will depend upon the external circumstances, well, and our own judgments and so on in the future that are going to be different than they are at the present moment, from one moment to the next. So this is the idea. We're taking that into account, right? We're thinking about the scheduling of our actions through time. And by the way, even if we don't think about this carefully, it will affect the result of our action. Right? This is the point. There's a logic here. There's inescapable consequences that come from these points. Now, we can economize our action then with respect to time by selecting the time placement of the action that gives us the greatest value of the action. Now, of course, we're going to do this in combination with the other elements of the action, right? So it's not that we're saying that we always schedule things out in such a way that we think we're going to get the greatest value in that sense, but the cost of getting the means will be greater next week, or the value of attaining the end will be lower next week, and so we just ignore that. No. We put all these things together. That's the point. We assess the time placement with respect to these other elements that we've already considered and talked about yesterday. Now, if this is true, then it follows that the value of a good that we use, since it's imputed, the value of the good is imputed by us from the value of the end that we are attaining. If we value an end more highly because we placed it on Friday instead of on Tuesday, then the value of the goods that we're going to use to attain that end would also have greater value to us on Friday than they would on Tuesday. So we'll have a difference in the valuation that we place, the marginal utility of the good, across these different moments in time, depending upon how we're assessing the circumstances within which we're acting. And because of this, of course, the good itself, or any particular good in principle itself, could have a different, a higher value at one moment and a lower value at another moment. And in the market, this is what leads to forward prices. This, by the way, is completely distinct and independent from the interest rate. A forward price is just when two parties today agree that at some date in the future, they'll make a spot exchange, trading a certain amount of a good of a certain type for a certain amount of money. They don't do anything in the present except agree to make a trade in the future, and that future trade will be a spot trade. There's no intertemporal dimension to this. And so there's no interest rate involved in this, right? And we already know what the implication of all this is. We get efficient temporal allocation of the good. So if forward prices for oil 6 months forward, let's say from today, are $100 a barrel, and the spot price today is $67 a barrel, well, then traders will take that into account in their economic calculation, the entrepreneurs involved in this industry, right? And they'll hold the supply off the market today. They'll just let it sit in storage. And then they'll supply it at the date in the future, right? Or they'll engage in forward transactions to sell it at the higher price in the future. And this arbitrage will bring the prices together. It'll stop, in other words, when we have a completely efficient allocation where we're not using a good that has lower valued uses among people today in lieu of using it at a later date where people will value it more highly. This is how the market creates efficiency in the allocation of goods, not just across people or across places, but also across time. So this is a very important function of markets in our lives. But it has nothing to do with the interest rate per se. I mean, you've already learned, of course, that you talked about the social division of labor. You've already learned that everything is interconnected, right? In an economy, everything is put together in relationship to everything else by human choice. And so we have to pay attention to those interconnections. But fundamentally, these are entirely different things. So let's go on to time preference. So again, the two ways in which we value action with respect to time are time placement and time preference. And time preference generates the interest rate. Time placement, again, generates this we might call it the temporal allocation of the good. The allocation of the good from one moment to another moment in time. Just like we would say the allocation of good from a person who values it less to a person who values it more, or a person in New York City who values it less to a person in London who values it more, and this kind of thing. Okay, so when we talk about time preference, the concept is looking just at each action. It's not looking at an action at different time frames. It's looking at an action that's already placed in the suitable time schedule. We're not looking at that element now. We're saying, suppose the start and the stop that I've got in this diagram has already been placed by the person where they want it in the flux of time. So that's not an issue. And we're going to look, time preference has to do with the interior intertemporal structure of the action. Okay, so we've already placed the action in the most advantageous start and stop duration. And we see, again, this, I've just divided out the two parts of the action, the period of production, the duration of serviceableness. And time preference says the following. It says that a person always prefers, given what we've said, always prefers to begin the satisfaction of the end closer to the start of the action. So if a person wants the duration of serviceableness to start at the middle vertical bar, whatever that day is or time, then a time preference says the person would always prefer the start of the period of production to move to the right and get closer and closer to the middle vertical line. You always want to shrink the period of production if you can get the same result, right? This is a ceteris paribus claim. And if we want to start the action at the left-hand side, if we want to start producing at the left-hand side, and we're not concerned about the duration of serviceableness, starting at the vertical line, then time preference says we want to move that vertical line closer to the start of the action. In other words, we always want to shrink the period of production. Ceteris paribus. If we can use the same inputs with the same resource costs and get the same result, we always prefer to shrink the period of production. Why is this? Well, as Mises puts it, there's disutility in waiting. Waiting provides us no utility whatsoever, quite to the contrary. There's disutility in waiting. It's a waste. To go back to my tree cutting example, if it were possible for me to engage in the tree cutting with everything else involved, the labor effort and the chainsaw and all the things that are involved in doing it, instead of taking 6 hours, if it just took 3 hours, that would be preferable. Because then I would be freed up 3 hours to do other things that are valuable. But waiting it just has disutility, as Mises says. In fact, if I could just snap my fingers and have it all done, even if I had to expend all of the resources in order to do it, that would be preferred, right? This is the idea of time preference, the fundamental notion of it. Now, this is a fairly technical and rather cumbersome way to talk about time preference. And so when you see time preference discussed in the literature, it's often done in a sort of summary way. With all these circumstances that I've talked about and ceteris paribus conditions, it's just assume that you already understand that's all that's in play, and the time placement and all of that, right? So here we get a kind of working definition of time preference. And you'll see this in Mises and Rothbard and Feder and the other authors that focus on this concept. A satisfaction sooner is preferred to the same satisfaction later. That's sort of a working definition of time preference. But remember, that's only in the technical circumstances that we talked about. Is that true? And the other thing to mention about this, notice, is that this is purely, just like preference itself, this is just a purely logical notion, right? We're not talking about physiological aspects of acting or psychological time preference is not that we're impatient or something. That's a psychological notion. Time preference is a logical principle of any and all action, regardless of whether a person's impatient or patient, or whether their physiological needs are met or not met or whatever. Those sorts of things can influence the intensity of a person's time preference, right? All the circumstances of acting can affect the intensity of our preferences for things. But when we talk about time preference, we're talking about it in the abstract conceptual sense, in the same way that we talked about preference yesterday. Preference is just a concept. It's a category of acting, right? And the same with time preference. It's a category. It's a necessary category of acting. So it's important to keep that in mind, especially when we think about the implications of time preference. And this is something that we'll talk about more, the faculty will talk about more this morning, is that time preferences then, depending on the intensity of people's time preferences in society, that will dictate the intertemporal production structure. And since the intertemporal production structure, we mine iron out of the ground, we produce steel, we refine the steel, we form body parts for an automobile, we assemble the car, we ship the car to the dealer puts it out on the lot, the customer comes and buys the car. That's the duration of that's the period of production, right, part. And then the car is used by the customer over and over, that's the duration of serviceableness. Right? That structure of production, the duration of it, the steps that are taken and so on, are all structured by or conform to the intensity of people's time preferences. As we say in economics, if people have lower time preferences, if they're more willing to incur the disutility of waiting, and they'll extend the processes of production out in time. And if they have higher time preferences and are less willing to do this, they'll choose shorter production processes. And so you could see the implications of this right away. Because people have time preference, they will always, in society, we're saying, in the market, the entrepreneurs will always choose the shortest, most productive production processes that are technically feasible. And then they'll extend those to the point where the costs of extending them further would rise sufficiently to make them not advantageous. And so when we think about what would happen if we have this structure of production in society, what would happen if people's time preferences went down or up? We could do this kind of dynamic analysis, right? Then they would, if people's time preferences go down, they would extend this length of the production processes, as Boom Bawerk put it, the roundaboutness of production, right? The stages of production through time, and be able to take advantage of longer, more productive production processes. And in the history of the human race, that's why we end up where we are, and not where people were in 5,000 BC. Because we've had low enough time preferences to engage in the saving and investing that's necessary to extend physical production processes, building up of capital structures and capacities and so on over time, to augment the productivity of labor and land and enjoy the 21st century standards of living. Okay, the other thing, the one so this is all again background that you'll see useful hopefully in the rest of the morning. And the other thing that we'll mention, the last thing, is then the pure rate of interest. So the pure rate of interest, we're going to use this word pure to identify the time preference premium of present money over future money. So fundamentally, the interest rate arises in the market where lenders and borrowers engaged in intertemporal exchange of money do so by voluntarily agreeing to a particular premium that's paid by the borrower to compensate the lender for the disutility of waiting, to compensate the lender for foregoing using the funds that are lent to buy consumer goods and enjoy sooner consumptive ends, to delay that into the future and then be compensated at the future moment with a greater payment that could be used to satisfy again other more valuable ends that the lender is anticipating. So this is the idea, right? And what we're going to show as we move along through this is that we're defining now the pure rate of interest as the time preference premium of present money over future money. You'll see, if you read the broader literature, you'll see that, especially in the neoclassical literature, the interest rate is, just like all prices, are in kind. They're in goods. And so you get barter exchange ratios in Maurasian general equilibrium models, and you get interest rates in some numeraire good, right? Apples or bags of flour or whatever. But actually, all economic calculation depends upon having money. And this, again, is what you're going to talk about in the next hour. You can't have economic calculation unless you have a common unit in which everything is being priced. And this also then includes intertemporal exchange. And so we want to show why that's so with respect to the interest rate. And we'll do that as we go through the rest of the material. All right, so here's the logic. Remember, we did this yesterday with prices. We put up that schematic. which showed that prices of consumer goods are just based upon our preferences, given our circumstance. Of course, we're always in particular objective circumstances that we're valuing and making our preferences, so that it's not that preferences are independent of that, of our circumstances. It's that our demands and supplies are determined by human judgment in those circumstances, and that our human judgments can't be, are not deterministically linked to those circumstances. There's some degree of volition that we have with respect to judging our circumstances. And so we're going to argue the same thing, right? The logic is exactly the same. We've got time preferences, and time preferences will when we interact with each other, we'll find that some people's time preferences are higher, and therefore the interest payments that they're willing to make to buy or demand present money from a lender will be high enough to give incentive to the lender to agree to the payment, the price, the interest payment, for foregoing the funds that are lent to the borrower. And then just like before, right, if we have these paired exchanges, we have plain states of rest. Every time a borrower and a lender come together and they make a contract, we're in a plain state of rest. The market's clearing, in other words. And so it's the same argument that the logic of it is the same that we presented on Monday when we talked about prices. Now, I want to emphasize this, and again, I'll fill in the argument here in just a minute. The pure rate of interest then is always intertemporal trade of money and not goods. And again, the emphasis here is that the reason for this is that money gives us the unit of economic calculation. And if we didn't use money in lending and borrowing, then entrepreneurs would not be able to integrate on a common unit the monetary results of their engaging in longer periods of production, right? Where they're fronting money, they're buying a factory and they're paying up front to buy the factory, and the factory is going to generate a stream of revenue for them for 30 years into the future. Or they're buying labor and they're paying up front to, right, every month they make a paycheck issued to the worker, and the worker's working on a project, but the output isn't going to be sold for 6 months. They're fronting the money, right? They're lending. And so this is the idea. They're not doing this in apples or in flour, bags of flour or whatever. They're doing this in money precisely because they want to be able to integrate that monetary result into all of the other monetary results of their costs and revenues and so on. And as I mentioned already, neoclassical models are almost always in barter exchange ratios, and then they just choose one of the goods as a numeraire, right? So everything's in barter exchange ratio. Let's just use apples, and it'll be the numeraire. And you can see that this is unacceptable. This is modeling gone bad. This is this is a deviation from the realism of the causal realist method that's more robust, precisely because it shows us how economic calculation, how the entrepreneurs integrate everything under economic calculation, whereas choosing a numeraire doesn't do this, right? Or saying, well, we have barter exchange ratios, and then money's just like a veil that kind of overcovers this, right? So that we as analysts, we can kind of then talk about money prices and so on. It's just an analytical device. No, that's not the way that the Austrian theory thinks about this. All right, so let's do a little bit of the nuts and bolts. Suppose we have person A on the left, whose preference rank I've reproduced, and you notice that person A has has a certain rank order of the value of $1,000 in this person's hand today. And this person would value more highly $1,100. We're assuming the purchasing power of the money will be the same in a year. We'll get to that point at the end, or we'll relax that assumption at the end. The person would accept $1,100 in a year and sacrifice the $1,000 today. They'd prefer the higher rank to the lower rank, but they wouldn't accept $1,090 in a year. If a borrower came to them and said, I'll give you $1,090 in a year if you lend me $1,000, they wouldn't do it. That's what that preference rank says, right? By the way, again, the preference rank is just an analytical device. Remember, what we're using it to explain is that you have actual people out in the world and they're doing this, right? They're negotiating and they say, but they can't reach an agreement and so they part ways. Or they reach an agreement and they make a trade. That's all we're using the preference rank to illustrate. It has to look like this logically. And you can see person B then has, as we say in economics, higher time preference, more intense time preference, more urgent desire for sooner satisfaction than person B has relative to person A. Because in order to bid away $1,000 from person B today, you'd have to pay a premium of $300. Whereas you could get $1,000 from person A just by paying a premium of $100, right? An interest payment of $100. And if you went to person B and even offered $1,290, if person B would lend $1,000 today, person B wouldn't do it. So person B and person A can make a mutually advantageous trade, right? At some interest rate between 10% and 29% inclusive. And when they make this exchange, the market clears. They're in a plain state of rest, given my preference rankings and so on. They don't want to continue on and trade more. They just trade this one instance, this one unit of money, and then they go home. So that's what happens in general, right? We depict this again with the market graph, but the market graph glosses over this fact. What's actually happening is you just have the two parties are coming together and they're making a trade. My son and his wife go down to the bank and they take out a mortgage. And when they consummate the contract, then they're in a plain state of rest. They don't take out a second mortgage. They just go home or back to their apartment and wait for the time when they can buy the house. So this is our depict, right? The interest rate will be at the point that clears the market. It clears the market because it's mutually advantageous between the traders, right? And at different potential interest rates, we wouldn't see some of the mutually advantageous trade take place. And therefore, those interest rates don't exist. One's higher above R0 or one's lower below R0. Now, notice one other parallel between our argument here and the argument we made on Monday about prices, preferences and prices, is that time preferences then determine both the pure rate of interest and the amount of lending and borrowing in society, the amount of PM or present money that's lent and borrowed. It determines both. Or you could say this in the more macroeconomic way, time preferences determine both the interest rate and the amount of saving and investing. It's important to keep all the logic of all this straight. It's easy to get twisted around in thinking this out. And remember again, we've already stipulated that these time preferences exist among people within their given circumstances. So we're already integrating into this analysis the objective circumstances of the world. We're not saying that that's irrelevant, but simply how people act in response to the objective circumstances is a matter of human judgment. It's a matter of preference establishment. Okay, so now we get to this point that I've been mentioning as we go along. How is it that the interest rate in money integrates economic calculation? And well, it does this in the calculation itself of how interest rates work with respect to the relationship between present money, that is money in your hand now, and money at a future point in time that's in your hand. And we're all familiar with this, with compounding, right? You go down to the bank, you take out a CD, you lend them $1,000, the interest rate's 10%, a year later, they pay you $1,100. The interest rate then means that you can either have $1,000 in your hand or you can have $1,100 in a year. They're equivalent. I can have either one. If the interest rate were 5%, then it would be $1,000 in your hand and $1,050 in a year. They're equivalent. The interest rate makes them equivalent, right? Objectively equivalent. So if I'm an entrepreneur engaged in buying the services of a worker for, a day or something, and I have to pay $1,000, or I'm determining what's my maximum buying price for the services. If I think that I'm going to get $1,100 in revenue from the services a year from now, when the product's finished, then I'll pay $1,000 for it today. I know that I'll pay $1,000 for it today because that amount of money is equivalent. This is the present value calculation. And those of you studying business, are already quite familiar with this calculation. But the reason why the calculation is meaningful, as opposed to just a formula, is because this is what allows the integration of intertemporal economizing to be done within the realm of economic calculation, monetary calculation. All right, so we could put it this way in summary of this point, that the pure rate of interest then equates the future value of money with the present value of money. And we mean objectively speaking, right? And this is across all persons, goods, places, times, and gives us this complete integration. Now, the last topic we want to take up quickly, at least introduce you to this, is what Murray Rothbard likes to call the time market. So he defines it this way. He says the time market is all intertemporal exchange of money. So any time a person engages in an intertemporal exchange of giving up present money in order to get money in the future, that would be part of the time market, and therefore it would command a rate of interest. Right? That kind of investment would earn interest as a rate of return. And then Rothbard subdivides the time market then into credit markets, which we've talked about already, right? We can go down to the bank, take it out. My son and his wife went down 3 or 4 years ago and took out a mortgage and bought a house in Grove City. So they're credit markets that provide consumer loans. And you can see, again, the advantage to them. They could have waited longer periods of time, saved up over time. They could have extended the period of production to buy the house through their own personal saving and come up with the entire fund. Or they can just find somebody who will lend them the money. And if they can find somebody to lend them the money, then they shrink that period of production. And if they're willing to pay the interest premium to accommodate that shrinking, they don't want to wait, because guess what? They're going to have kids, and they don't want to raise kids in a crummy 2-bedroom apartment. They tried that for a year. It didn't work out very well. So they bought a house, and now they got 2 kids. So I'm not sure what that means for the future. But I say the more the merrier as a grandparent. So, and then we could have producer loans, right? We could have entrepreneurs that go into the credit markets and borrow, and we can have capitalists then, as we'd use that term. Perhaps, again, Dr. Peter Klein was using that term in talking about entrepreneurship. We have capitalists who would come into partnership with the entrepreneurs and lend them funds. And then those producer loans are used by the entrepreneurs to invest in the capital structure. And so that's the second subcomponent of the time market. It's the capital structure itself, all production, in other words, where the entrepreneur is fronting money to the owners of the factors of production, or buying assets that have, where they front the money to buy the asset and then they earn revenues in the future. That too will command a rate of interest. And so this is where we get the manifestation in the market economy of the importance of the rate of interest, how the rate of interest guides the intertemporal structure of the whole capital production process in the market. And you can see then, and you'll learn again more about this this morning, you could see how disruptive it is for the chairman of the Fed, chairman of the board of governors of the Federal Reserve System, to cave into Trump for cheap credit. What if the central bank just produces credit ad infinitum through monetary inflation and pushes down interest rates? You can see how this would now affect the entire structure of capital investment, moving toward longer, extended capital structures, which if we're not saving and investing sufficiently according to our time preference, will not be sustainable in the market. And so this is where is the implication that you'll see again later this morning. All right, so we've come to the close. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you. All right, we have a 15-minute break and we'll reconvene.
Please, please take your seats. Thank you. We're about to start. We have 1 minute. Okay, this is an important lecture, so please try to stay awake for it. There'll be plenty of time to sleep during the next lecture when Patrick Newman is talking about capital theory. Okay. All right, so my topic for this morning is calculation and socialism. And I'm going to really focus on a particular article by Ludwig von Mises, which I consider to be the greatest article in economics written in the 20th century, and maybe in the history of economic thought, as an article. I'm not comparing it to books. It did two things, and it did them definitively. It completely destroyed the intellectual foundations of socialism. And that in itself was a great achievement. But it was also a revolutionary breakthrough in price theory, okay? Following on Menger, Mises showed the importance of pricing in an economy, the importance to human welfare, and did it in a way that really couldn't be refuted. So I highly recommend, we have this in pamphlet form. There's an introduction or an epilogue by a notable modern Austrian in this booklet, so make sure you read that too. It's at the end. Salerno. Okay. Let me just start with the difference between two groups of socialists. One were the so-called utopian socialists. They were the earlier socialists, and the other was quote, scientific socialists. And that was, scientific socialism was developed by Karl Marx. And it was really a polemical ploy. It wasn't an actual system, but it was a way to shut the utopian socialists up, who were all crazy, as we'll see. I'll give you an example of that. This is Charles Fourier, a French socialist. You can tell by his face he's up to no good, right? I mean, it's the opposite of human welfare. He came up, just to outline his nutty ideas, he came up with something called the phalanstère, which refers to a Roman military formation. He said that under in his world of socialism, and they all had different, every single socialist had their own little method of implementing socialism. So his was that there would be 1,500 to 1,600 residents, which was a Roman phalanx, as I said, a military formation, or an ancient Greek military formation. They would live in a huge grand hotel style house or building. Each would purchase their own accommodations according to their individual tastes and income. All residents would be a stockholder in the city. There would be collective production. All tasks would be cooperation. Not much about the division of labor, which we saw from Professor Jonathan Newman, is so important to a modern economy. All would share meals in a communal kitchen, and the dirty work would all be shared. Okay. So there was a sketch that he had made of the phalanstère. Now notice how symmetrical it is. All of these socialists had a mania for symmetry. You know, everything had to be symmetrical and look very nice and so on. He even had a model of it built. And so that's the vision of his socialist utopia. That's the reality. That's actually near my house or my home in New Jersey, where I live half the year, and it's still standing. And you know, it was abandoned pretty quickly after the group of socialists moved in. Let me just talk about some of his ramblings very quickly. So I'm setting it up so that you see why Marx came up with this notion of scientific socialism. He according to Fourier, 19th century France was in the fifth stage of advancement, all right? They passed through confusion, savagery, patriarchism, barbarity. After passing through two more stages, it would approach the upward slope of harmony. the final stage of utter bliss, which would last for 8,000 years. Now, how does he know all of these things? Well, every socialist has a gnosis, an intuition, a secret source of knowledge that only they are privy to, and no one else can figure out why or where this comes from. They have to take the head socialist at his or her word. However, after you've gone through this harmony for 8,000 years, history reverses itself, okay? And it runs back to the beginning. Also, some other things, it gets better. Fourier said that the changes that would accompany harmony, 6 new moons would replace the one in existence, okay? A halo showering gentle dew would circle the North Pole. The seas would turn to Kool-Aid, or whatever juice they would, children's drink they would have back then. All violent or repulsive, this is great, I like this. All violent or repulsive beasts would be replaced by their opposites and would be commonplace, and they would serve mankind. Anti-lions would offer themselves to humans to be ridden, and roasted anti-chickens would fly into human mouths. The human lifespan in the harmonic stage, that final stage of 8,000 years, would stretch to 144 years, and 5/6 of this, 5/6, not 7/8, of the time would be devoted to the unrestrained pursuit of sexual love. That's always, since men are, for the most part, were the ones who came up with these schemes, that's always a part of this. Free love is always a part of these utopian social schemes. Okay, so all of this embarrassed Marx, okay, who was a radical socialist, a communist from the very early days. The classical economists we talked about, they didn't have a completely consistent and correct system of economics, but they were, just with their simple supply and demand, they were able to smash all the utopian socialists. Okay, and they basically asked the question, who will take out the garbage under socialism? So it was an incentive problem. They saw socialism as an incentive problem. And they did point out that the price system would help entrepreneurs allocate resources to the most valuable wants. So as Mises pointed out, the classical economic system was a system of calculated action. It just wasn't traced back to consumers. That was the problem with the classical school. But they knew enough and were smart enough and insightful enough to smash the socialists. The socialist answer was very weak. It was, oh, well, there'll be a new socialist man and woman. They would be magically or mystically transformed into someone who worked not for money, but for the common welfare, okay? But both sides assumed it was only an incentive problem, that socialism would be as productive as capitalism if you could solve the incentive problem. So that's where the debate stood when Mises wrote his article, okay? Now, as I said, just to talk about Marx for a moment, he realized the harm that these crazy scribblings of the utopian socialists did. You know, classical economists smashed them, people laughed at them. So he devised the system or the ideology of scientific socialism. And he said, look, we don't know what the future socialist society is going to look like, nor do we care, okay? The inexorable, what he called the inexorable laws of history dictated that socialism would replace capitalism, just as capitalism replaced feudalism, just as feudalism replaced classical slave systems. It was a march towards socialism and eventually communism. There was sort of a difference between the stages, which I won't get into. Therefore, anyone who said anything about what the future socialist society may look like was unscientific. The laws of history had spoken. This is how things were going to develop. So to try to for the puny human mind to try to figure out what the laws of history had in store for mankind was totally unscientific. So therefore, his writings, so think about his main writing, Das Kapital, Capital. All he wrote about, he didn't write about the socialist society, he wrote about capitalism and its contradictions, why it was going to fall apart. Okay, he would only go that far, that it would fall apart and socialism would succeed capitalism. Okay, so that's where everything stood. Mises wanted to break down this whole idea of scientific socialism. He wanted to take a look at what socialism would look like and how it could perform beyond the incentive problem. So his thesis was very simple. It was called the impossibility thesis. Socialism was impossible because with complicated production processes and multitudes of capital goods and technology that allowed you to use those capital goods in many, many different, almost infinite combinations, an economy was impossible with calculation with cardinal numbers being the prices. So it was impossible because it could not generate prices for capital goods and natural resources. Why? Well, Mises had a very straightforward, step-by-step, simple to understand rationale for his claim. First, socialism abolishes private property. That's how it is defined. There was a great book written by a German teacher of Menger who had some socialist leanings. His name was Schaeffler. And it's called the Essence of Socialism. And so he looked at all the socialist schemes through history, and he said they all came down to one thing: the abolition of private property. So that's how Mises defines socialism, as the abolition of private property in the material means of production, not in your own body, but in capital goods and natural resources. Since a socialist state would abolish private property, it would become the sole owner of all resources. That being the case, there would be no exchange. Okay? The socialist state would monopolize all resources, so there couldn't be any exchange, which means there couldn't be any markets or prices. Therefore, with no prices, the state would be unable to calculate costs of production. They may be able to if they allow people to get paid, which isn't necessarily ruled out by socialism. If they allow them to get paid in money, there could be consumer prices, but you couldn't compare them to costs, because there would be no cost of production. They couldn't be calculated because of the fact that there's no exchange of capital goods and natural resources. And that being the case, you could never figure out profit or loss. You could never figure out where the more important uses of resources were and where the less important uses that should be avoided are. So that was Mises' argument. Okay, it was a devastating argument. The socialists were sent into a tizzy, at least in Germany in the 20s. It didn't reach the English-speaking world until the 1930s, the debate. So they all tried to answer Mises, and I'll talk about some of their answers towards the end. But here is the point for Mises. Now, some Austrians claim that the reason why socialism can't calculate is because they can't use all the dispersed knowledge that's in the heads of different consumers and entrepreneurs and resource owners. But that's not the essence of socialism. The essence is that when you abolish private property and set up a monopoly, you only have one will that controls the allocation of those resources. And with one will, okay, even if it's a group of people, men and women together, who are the central planning board, with one will, there can be no exchange. There can be no difference in value scales. So Mises wrote, and this is worth quoting, "The essential mark of socialism is that one will alone acts." It's not that different people have different knowledge and we can't combine it. That's a problem, but that's not the essential problem. It is immaterial whose will it is. So it could be an angel, it could be a devil, it could be a good guy, a bad guy. The main thing is that the employment of all factors of production is directed by one agency only. One will alone chooses, decides, directs, acts, gives orders. The distinctive mark of socialism is the oneness and indivisibility of the will, directing all production activities within the whole social system. Because one person or group of people not having access to calculation, not having access to prices, cannot figure out the best use of these hundreds of thousands of different resources in different locations, which can be combined in an almost infinite, especially in a modern economy, infinite number of combinations, okay? How do you know exactly, if you were put in charge of the US economy right now, and let's say you were cut off from all world prices, so you're the czar of the US economy, and you have all of these capital goods, everything that exists in the US and all these natural resources, how would you figure out the one combination of all of these resources that would optimize or best serve consumer demand at the lowest possible cost. It would be impossible. It would be like put in the middle of a desert trying to get to a particular location, not having a compass, and not knowing where you exactly are, okay? So what are the preconditions of economic calculation? First of all, private property in all stages of goods, not just in consumer goods, but in capital goods and natural resources, in land, in forests, in streams, and so on. The second is freedom. Not only do you have to have private property, but you have to be able to exchange these goods. There has to be markets for all goods, not just consumer goods, but for capital goods and so on. And there has to be sound money. So when you see the prices, those prices aren't falsified by the creation of new money, okay? So we've never had all of these preconditions in a pure sense, but for the most part, in real-world capitalist economies, that has existed, okay? So, given that socialism abolishes all three of these preconditions of calculation, it not only abolishes economic calculation, it abolishes what Dr. Newman talked about yesterday, the division of labor, which is so important to the productivity of an economy, and it abolishes the society itself. Okay. So let's look at the problem with socialist central planning. We're not saying that socialists can't produce things. They can produce a lot of different things. They're scientists. Certainly in Soviet Russia, their scientists were as competent as our scientists, and their engineers also could do the same things that Western engineers could do. And they had the technical knowledge. So let's say somebody wants to, the Commissar or the Central Planning Board is deciding whether to produce a certain model car. He knows the production function. The production function is what we call in economics, we use that term in economics to refer to the recipe for building anything, for producing anything. So you would know that this car would need a specific amount of steel, P tons of steel, Q hours of machine time, certain number of hours of unskilled labor, a certain amount of engineering labor and factory space and so on, and you come out with this car, which is a beautiful car. It's a Cadillac CT5 Blackwing, which I've been looking at, but it's way out of my price range. But anyway, so you would know how to build it. The problem is, how can you decide whether or not to build it? How can we calculate the cost of producing this car under socialism? So in the market economy, we know that all resources, right now as we speak, all resources have prices. Steel, engineering services, electricity, factory space, all of them have prices. There is a structure of prices existing at every moment. It's changing continually, even as I speak. But there's always a set of prices of capital goods and natural resources that an entrepreneur who knows his product or her production function can then calculate the costs from, okay? You can always calculate the cost for any, even if it's a crazy idea about producing something. You can calculate the cost because the price system exists and at every moment, okay? So then let's assume that the average cost of producing this car is $60,000. Now firms, they don't know the selling price of this car, and let's say it goes for, it takes a number of years to bring it from the engineering's drawing board to the dealer's showroom, so that you have to forecast 3 or 4 years in the future. Well, even that's doable. Entrepreneurs can make educated guesses, educated forecasts based on their past experience and based on what they know about just present prices that they're just seeing. They can guess about how things will change and what price that car may sell for. Now, they're fallible human beings, they can be wrong. And if they're wrong, they'll waste resources. So let's assume that they believe the price will be $70,000. Well, that's a profitable endeavor. That means that they're using 60,000 resources that are worth $60,000 producing other things in society, they're combining them in a new way to produce an automobile that people value at $70,000. They're moving resources from lower value to higher valued uses. So they're benefiting society and themselves at the same time. On the other hand, if they forecast that the output price of this automobile will be $55,000, $5,000 less than its cost of production, then they know that they would be wasting resources. Now, some entrepreneurs may mistakenly think the future price is $70,000 and build it, and it turns out to be $55,000 or $50,000, and they lose money. Well, in that, we shouldn't feel sorry for them. Okay, in that case, they're wasting scarce resources. Those resources could have been used by other entrepreneurs who are bidding them. That's why the price is $60,000, right? The entrepreneurs are bidding them up in other areas of production to that level because they believe that's what the value they will add to the product that they will be producing. So they're wasting resources because their product has only returned $55,000. And so the value of the resources that we use were greater than the value to consumers of the output. Okay. Also, there are many different decisions to be made in building this automobile. And the bumper is one example. Should we use titanium, steel, or fiberglass for the bumper? Okay, we used to have steel bumpers, and we've moved to fiberglass bumpers. Okay, and there are reasons for doing that. Right, the more expensive and heavier steel bumpers just weren't raise the cost of the car without raising the value of the car by more than the cost of using the steel. Okay. Also, what technology is the best in the sense of the lowest cost technology, given what the product that you want? There's a big Kia firm, which is about 20 miles north of here on Route 85, and it's pretty much all robotic. So should we build a plant to build this car that uses a lot of robots and just a few guys that are pushing buttons? Or should we use a more standard or a more conventional type setup with an assembly line and laborers? Should we use more labor and less capital, more capital? They would know what to do, okay? And beyond that, they wouldn't know whether to produce 20,000 of these cars or 2 million bicycles. They wouldn't know which, assuming they use the same resources, they wouldn't know which was more valuable to consumers, okay? Because they can't calculate the costs and the revenues. Okay, so I have a friend I grew up with, a woman I grew up with, who actually married a real cowboy, somebody who actually owned a ranch out in Montana. And so this is about 15 years ago. I was talking to her, and she said, "Oh, we're getting a new house." I said, "Oh, you're moving off the ranch?" She said, "No, we're having a house delivered." I said, "What?" So evidently, in Montana, where there's about 10 people, you don't have a lot of labor. Is very expensive. Okay, so capital. It's better to use a production to produce or a technology to produce a home that's capital intensive rather than labor intensive. So that home, which is not hers, but it's like hers, this is modularly built, was built in Omaha, 687 miles away from her house, from the site, and then shipped to Biddle, Montana, where she lives. And it was put there. It was put together there. It used a few laborers, but not as many as you would need to have on site to build a house right there. Now, could a socialist planner figure out that it's actually a better use of resources to build a house 687 miles away and then ship it? There'd be no way to figure that out. So this is because of calculation. Without calculation, okay, you couldn't make these kinds of decisions. You couldn't even conceive that this would be a better way of doing things. Let's skip over that. Now let's look at how production took place in the former Soviet Union. It was called gross output planning, okay? So basically what they did was they set quantitative targets for each industry. Okay, so each industry was told to produce so many yards of cloth, so many tons of nails, so many pairs of shoes, okay? they weren't, there were no prices involved. They were given these gross output targets, that is, in terms of natural units, the units of the good itself. But when you do that, it's very difficult to specify the quality. So they ran into the quality of the nails, the sizes of the women's clothing that they were asking them to produce, and so on. So, for example, in the nail industry, and this is a true example, they were told to produce so many tons of nails. So all of the firms in that industry produce very heavy and large nails. So what we found was that there were a gross shortage of roofing nails. So there were many structures that were built, completely built in the Soviet Union, didn't have roofs. And the reason why they didn't was because there weren't enough roofing nails, okay? Other examples, women hated clothing that was produced because they were produced according to how many yards, or you were judged as a manager of a Soviet plant on the number of yards that your target was. So you wanted to, that's another thing, you wanted to meet your target, but you didn't want to go too much over, even if you could produce more than they were asking. Because if you produce more, then the next year they would say, you lied, we're going to increase your target, okay? And if you didn't meet your target, you went to Siberia. So it was a mutual lying game. You would lie that, I can't produce that much. And they knew you were lying, so they would say, no, you can, would give you a bigger target, okay? So you would just try to reach it, and you would, and so on. Then there was the famous case of Khrushchev, the Soviet premier in the late 50s, early 60s, who told a story at the Politburo, which got out to the West, that he was bashing the chandelier producers in the Soviet Union, because it turns out that the dachas, the luxury villas that the party bigwigs lived in, the chandeliers were pulling the ceilings down and killing them because they were so heavy, because they were stated in terms of how many pounds of chandeliers or tons of chandeliers you had to produce, okay? So then there's a famous joke about Hong Kong. Again, going back to Khrushchev, during the 1950s, he famously took his shoe off and banged it on the table at a UN meeting and said, "We will bury you," meaning we will economically bury the West because we have a much more productive economy. And the CIA believed that, by the way. The CIA thought that they were going to catch up to us. But in any case, Soviet economists, when they met with their Western counterparts, would kind of joke and say, "We will bury you, but we're going to leave Hong Kong so we can see the prices." And we can because that's exactly what they did, okay? So here's the famous cartoon of the Soviet nail. This is he's saying, "Well, comrade, Comrade Commissar, I met my target." So, it's like a 50-ton or 5,000-ton nail or something. And that was in a Soviet publication. Okay. So before we get to the social appraisement process, let me just mention the criticism of Mises, and that was, well, the Soviet Union lasted for 75 years. How could socialism be impossible if that were the case? But Mises met this argument in his very first article, the one that I mentioned at the beginning. Mises said the Soviet Union is like the post office in the middle of a free market economy, a government post office. It can use the technology and the pricing of the firms around it, okay, who are making things that were similar to it. So it wasn't a true socialist economy. A socialist economy would be one that was world-embracing, or one in which you completely cut yourself off from the rest of the world. And also it engaged in foreign trade. It sold gold, electricity, diamonds to the West, so it had some information on prices. It used Western prices. It bought Western trade journals and catalogs and so on. Supposedly Red China had purchased or ordered thousands of Sears catalogs at some point. And so they could use the prices there. Now, that they weren't efficient prices because they weren't the prices of their resources, but there were prices of resources that were located elsewhere and that were very like the resources that they were using. So they could limp along uneconomically in that way. And also there was a system of black markets. Famously, Beatles records and denim jeans and many other things from the West were sold on this black market, and the government looked the other way. They also looked the other way on trade between different firms that bartered. If they had, one firm had too much cloth and needed some extra steel, they would trade with the firm that had the excess of steel. And so then there were exchange ratios. So there was some kind of very rudimentary calculation going on there. The only period of true socialism occurred from 1917 to 1921. It was called war communism. It was when the war was being waged between the Bolsheviks, the Reds, and the white armies who supported the Tsar, or the return of the Tsar. And they were given an order by Lenin, the commissars, the heads of the various industries, to not look at any prices, not calculate with prices, but just come up with their targets in other ways, but not to use money or prices. So money and prices were abolished. And pretty soon, the stores were empty, and people were beginning to burn their furniture and other things just to keep warm. And then eventually they couldn't even live in the cities, and they just the cities emptied out, and they foraged for their subsistence in the countryside. So yeah, socialism can exist for nomadic tribes. I mean, if everybody's going out and hunting and sharing, I mean, that's the level at which it can exist. It cannot run a modern industrial economy, or even an industrial economy as it was in the 1920s, okay? All right, so what Mises was talking about was what we call the social appraisement process, a very fancy name. It simply means that, that the market economy determines prices through entrepreneurs looking ahead, forecasting what future consumer prices will be, and then based on these prices, bidding prices for the capital goods that they had to use to implement the technology to produce that good, okay? So it allowed, the entrepreneurs are continually bidding, as we speak today, for these resources, and that is causing a structure of prices which you can use, if any of you are entrepreneurs, to produce any good that you think consumers will value more than the cost that you've laid out for it, okay? I can't stress that enough. So they're the entrepreneurs in the middle of the whole process, okay? So they're looking ahead, looking up at what prices they believe will be paid for various goods that they're thinking of producing in the future. And based on those prices and their experience, they're then bidding against each other for resources. And at the end of this bidding process, you have the costs that we all see and relate with, and then the quantities of goods that are produced. And eventually, when those quantities of goods come out in the next several months or years, the demand of consumers determines their prices. Some entrepreneurs may be right, others may be wrong. The ones that are wrong lose money, they suffer losses. The ones that are right earn profits. And that, by the way, brings into a play a selective, what Mises called the selective process. The entrepreneurs that are right and earn profits are accumulating capital. They're becoming larger and larger players in the capital goods market. They're becoming the main deciders of how the allocation of resources should be in the economy. Let me just mention something. There was a Star Trek episode many years ago, the original, the good one, in which there was a planet where there was an empath, somebody who could immediately absorb all of the emotions and values of the people around her. And So even if you thought of even if you could bethink someone like this, who could knew all the value scales of all the consumers, okay, and could give orders about what to be produced, even that person would not be able to arrange resources in a way that optimizes consumer satisfaction, okay? Because that person is a single will and doesn't have any means of calculation. So Mises called this the intellectual division of labor. All of us play a part in generating these prices as consumers, as laborers, as resource owners, as entrepreneurs. Okay? So prices are genuinely a social phenomenon. We're always told that, well, society doesn't like this, or society doesn't like that, or this is a social phenomenon. Well, prices are really a social phenomenon. Each of us contributes a bit to its production in our choices about what to buy and what not to buy, where to work, where not to work, and so on. But none of us can create a price structure in our own minds, okay? It requires an intellectual division of knowledge. And that has nothing, of labor, and that has nothing to do with dispersed knowledge, okay? It has to do with the fact that people have different wills and different values and are interacting in a way that generates, voluntary exchange, generates the price structure. As I pointed out, number 3, this price structure allows entrepreneurs to compute money costs of any conceivable production process and compare costs to anticipated prices on the market. Now, what are some of the naive Marxist responses that occurred in the 1920s, mainly in Germany? The first was by the radical, fanatical Marxist Otto Neurath. And he said, well, what's the problem? We'll just add up the stuff that we're producing and compare it to the stuff that we're using to produce those goods. But so he's, in effect, actually believed you could add apples and oranges. It's crazy. You couldn't get a single unitary number, though, to let you know. I mean, you use tons of steel, kilowatts of electricity, gallons of paint. How do you add them all up to come up with a cost of production? So he was an idiot. You can calculate with labor hours, they said. Oh, well, look, every good uses labor in its production. But there's a number of things, of course, that's wrong with this. First of all, labor hours aren't all homogeneous. So there's different qualities, from software engineers to McDonald's cashiers to the hours of brain surgeons' labor. They're all different. They can't be added together. They're as different as apples and oranges when you come down to it. Also, it ignores the difference in the quality of labor. Is LeBron James really an hour of his labor or two hours out on the court to be compared to 2 hours of labor for the 12th guy on the bench who's gawky and barely can move around? No, basketball players in the same industry have different quality for their labor. So you can't calculate. Oh, and also, of course, goods are not just produced with labor, right? They're produced with more or less capital, more or less natural resources. So this completely leaves out of account capital goods and natural resources, which means they're not economized because they're not counted in the calculation. So that's a cretinous idea, too. Assuming a stationary economy, this is one of their favorites. They say, look, capitalism produces, and we see what they're doing. We will just tell the managers, the capitalist managers, we'll get rid of the owners, but we'll tell the managers who are there on site, just do tomorrow, the first day of socialism, what you did today, and just keep doing it. Okay, now why is that stupid? It's dumb because that assumes that new technology never develops, natural resources are never depleted or never come online, are never discovered, and that consumer value scales never change. The whole point of having a price system is to deal with the reallocation of resources as things continually change, okay? As consumers change their tastes, as new and better products are developed, and so on. They wouldn't be able to handle that. They kept doing the same things. And as Murray Rothbard points out, in the first 3 months, everything might go all right, but then as you get further and further away from the actual economic data, the actual value scales of technology and resources, things will just start to fall apart, okay? As resources are depleted, capital goods wear out, and so on. Okay. All right, what about the more advanced solutions? I can just touch on these because I hardly have any time. There were sophisticated, well-trained neoclassical economists came up with responses in the 1930s when the Mises critique was brought to Great Britain and the United States by Hayek and others. And they have a number of solutions, trial and error method, in which you set prices, and if there's a surplus, then you lower the price. If there's a shortage, then you raise the price. Or market socialism. Under market socialism, you would have the planners setting the prices, and then the managers of the different firms using those prices to calculate, and then to sell the good and then to produce at the lowest possible cost, and then to sell the good at another price that is set by the planners. And if there were shortages and surpluses, then the planners would adjust the prices to make them go away. But the question is, where the hell did these prices come from? So they just made them up. They picked them out of a hat, okay? So people who are followers of Mises, like Robbins and Hayek, pointed out that even if this solution could work, it would take a while how often are they going to change prices from the center? Okay, central planning of prices, every 2 months, every 3 months. The market economy does it on a daily or moment-to-moment basis. They change prices as we see disequilibria. And second, how do you bring together, for the mathematical solution, where you bring together all the data about technology and tastes and resources, and you plug it into a set of simultaneous equations, and you solve them, and you get prices and quantities. But once again, Rothbard and Robbins, looking at the practicality of all this, said, well, there weren't any computers back then, so it would take months and months to solve the set of equations for a large economy. But not only that, it would take a long time to find out this knowledge. But by the time you got it, plugged it in, and then solved the equations, it would be outdated. It would be months outdated. So they kind of looked at the mathematical side of it. But Mises looked more deeply into the theoretical side, and he said, well, market socialism is playing market, because managers don't run the economy. It's not a managerial economy. It's an entrepreneurial economy. Owners run the economy. Owners destroy lines of production. They get rid of them, and they invest in new lines of production. They don't just follow prices going up or down and stay in the same business. They move across the economy with their capital. So that was a devastating critique. And he also pointed out that, and if you look around you today, all the capital goods in the United States right now are wrong. Wrong in the sense that if people who had built those capital goods years ago, in the case of railroads and airplanes 25 years ago and further, if they knew what consumer value skills would be today, they would not have built some of those capital goods. So those capital goods, we're still using them because they're still useful, but we want to know how quickly we should allow them to wear out and replace them with new capital goods that are better adjusted to what consumers want. So that's a very subtle argument that Mises came up with in Human Action. I don't expect you to grasp that right now, but basically, profits and losses continuously lead us to adjust our productive processes to what consumers want. Okay, thank you. Okay, we have a 15-minute break now.
We got 2 minutes, I think. All right. Well, I guess we'll get started. So, hello, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Patrick Newman. I'll be talking about Austrian capital theory today. I just want to mention I have the unique honor, I guess, of presenting right before both lunch and dinner. So I have a tremendous amount of power, and I plan on abusing it. But anyway, you guys have to suffer through me twice today. So we decided, well, how can we compensate the students for that? And I thought of the idea, well, we should have a pool party, right? But no. So the pool party is tonight, but you will have to get through 2 of my talks first. So what's this presentation about, and why should you care? Because you see the title and it says Austrian capital theory, and you're kind of wondering, like, okay, I haven't heard this in an economics class before. Well, you're going to learn about capital theory, right? A very famous book on capital theory by really we can say the Austrian founder of capital theory, Eugen von Bomberwerk. It's called Capital and Interest. And what can we define as capital theory? How can we define capital theory right now? Just sort of a simple definition. And it's the study of mankind's network of produced factors of production and what causes it to change. Right? In a traditional mainstream economics course or a neoclassical economics course, you don't really learn about capital theory at all. You, of course, might learn about capital goods, but this discussion of a network, or what we will call a structure, of production, a capital structure, is something you don't really hear about, as well as any sort of emphasis on changes in that structure. That's not really big in most standard accounts of production theory, right? So this is what I want to talk about today. And some of the important terms that we're going to cover in this lecture, and some really important concepts in capital theory. We mentioned the structure of production, so we're going to learn about that, right? Or what's also known as the production structure, sort of this temporal pipeline where goods are transformed. Capital goods are transformed into more capital goods and then consumer goods. We're going to learn about specificity, right? So the fact that capital goods, they all can't produce the same consumer goods. Some of them are more suited for certain tasks. Some of them are less suited for tasks. We're going to learn about time, right? We're going to talk about time, or how time is involved in this. All right, we're going to learn about savings, postponing present consumption for a greater amount of future consumption, and what Bomberwerk called roundaboutness, so longer production processes, and why the most productive production processes tend to be the longer ones. So some of this has been covered before, say in the introductory talk, Mengerian analysis, and the history of the Austrian School by Dr. Salerno. And of course, we had Dr. Herbener's talk on interest theory and so on, but we're going to kind of continue to sort of build off of some of those foundational lectures to in this current lecture. All right, so when we mentioned capital goods and we mentioned capital theory, I would go so far as to argue that capital goods are really what makes humans unique, in a sense. Yes, humans act, we know that, but what really separates human movements or human behavior from other animals' behaviors is the fact that we're creating capital goods, right? And that we continually create better and better capital goods. So standards of living have risen from barbarism, sort of a very primitive lifestyle, to the modern level because of an increasingly intricate structure of capital goods. Your living standards are higher than your parents' living standards are higher than your grandparents, so on and so forth, right? And we all know this. We all have access to better and better types of capital goods, which allows us to have access to better and better types of consumer goods. Beavers are still making dams, right? So beavers, you could say, make capital goods, and ants maybe dig tunnels or whatever. But tens of thousands of years later, they're basically doing the same thing, right? Humans have moved past huts, right? You'd say we started off here. Then we've moved to sort of the Middle Ages, something like that. All right, that's more advanced. All right, then we got a nice house, and then we have the Jetsons, right? Which we're not quite there yet, but maybe we'll get there. But soon enough. But so this is, and we could describe this for everything. The cell phones that you have in your pockets are way more advanced than before. The cars, the planes, the buildings, whatever. Right? We are continually developing more and more types of capital goods and in greater quantities. All right, so I'm talking about capital goods. What are capital goods? And we want to just kind of briefly go through a little bit of that Mengerian analysis that was discussed yesterday when we talk about, all right, what are capital goods? How are they different than other factors of production, consumer goods, and so on? So we know from praxeology, the science of human action, that humans act, right? They use means to achieve ends. All of you are acting right now, and all of you will be acting in the future, right? So suppose you're hungry, you buy food at the grocery store, then you make a sandwich, finally you eat the sandwich. So far in Mises University, you've probably wondering yourself, why do Austrian economists constantly talk about sandwiches? It's like we're talking about sandwiches, making a ham sandwich, making a turkey sandwich, whatever. It's just an easy sort of basic thing to describe, to cover some elementary economic principles, and who doesn't like sandwiches? The finished sandwich, right, whatever type of sandwich is being made, that is what is called a good of the first order. It's a consumer good. It directly satisfies your end, right? Your end of wanting to feel full, you're hungry, or you could be eating this sandwich, not necessarily because you're hungry, but you're trying to bulk up, you're trying to put on muscle, or you want to, you want to meet some other type of fitness goal or whatever, or you're trying to please the person who made the sandwich for you. You don't want to look rude or whatever, all right? The sandwich that's made in the kitchen is a good of the second order, right? It has to be further transformed in order to become the consumer good. It has to be brought to, wherever you are sitting, whether it's at the kitchen table or it's upstairs in your bedroom or it's in front of the TV or it's packed in, a lunch pail or whatever, right? The ingredients that make that sandwich are goods of the third order. So you got to have the turkey in the refrigerator. You got to have the bread. You got to have the mayonnaise. You got to have lettuce, tomato. You can't forget, your oil and vinegar and oregano and so on. And we could keep going back farther and farther. We could look at goods of the fourth order, which are the goods that are bought in the grocery store, right? Goods of the fifth order is the turkey at the wholesale level, right? Or then you go back to the turkey at the farm, right? So on and so forth, or the wheat that's harvested out of the ground, right? All of those goods, the second to the nth order goods, those are known as higher order goods, right? Those are all, in a sense, we're including land and labor, which we're going to talk about here, but we can think of just those produced goods. Those are the capital goods, right? They are produced, right? And they are turned in, they will be used to make another capital good or eventually a consumer good. Right, and this is what distinguishes us from animals. We just continually create more and more capital goods, higher and higher and higher orders of capital goods, okay? So, taken together, we're looking at everything that we've just covered. We have a structure of production for a sandwich, right? We can see that the general process is transforming higher order goods into a consumer good, such as, in particular, the sandwich, all right? Sometimes you might only have one higher order good. Sometimes you have two. Sometimes you have three, right? Sometimes it could take an hour to make something. Sometimes it could take 10 years to make something, right? Now, we have this structure of production, or this production structure, and what we could do is we could divide it up. It could be a bit arbitrary how we do this, but we could say, well, the production of each good makes up a separate stage of production, right? We could say, well, the first stage is, one stage is making the sandwich in the kitchen. Another stage, stage before that could be, well, we've got to get the food at the grocery store. The stage before that could be, well, we've got to actually produce the food that's sold at the grocery store, so on and so forth. Okay, so any action always involves a structure of production. It could be very simple structure production, or it could be very complicated, right? We think about the technology that is sort of captivating everyone right now, artificial intelligence, right? What's the structure of production for AI, right? For some sort of language learning model, or large language model, however we want to look at it. it is not very simple. We might just think, well, it's just typing something into the computer and having the AI spit something out. No, it goes well before that, right? There's the coding, there's the developing the energy infrastructure, there's the engineers involved in that. I mean, some of these processes could take years, if not longer. It's a very complex structure of production, but all we see is just the back end, right? All we see is just we put something into a computer or whatever. Okay, all right. So when we talk about capital goods, it's helpful to distinguish capital goods from the other factors of production, right? We know, again, that there are 4 factors of production. We have labor, right? As humans, we could say it's produced, or humans are produced by other humans, but it's sort of a different production process, you could say. But humans, right? We are working, we're involved in production processes and so on and so forth. You have the land, which is the nature-given resources that we just say is a factor of our environment, and the space we stand on, right? The Mises Institute is sitting on valuable land, right? And it's next to the stadium. It's in Auburn and so on. Some of you might be going to college at various universities that are in cities or by a nice lake or something like that. That land is very valuable. The actual land we stand on that can make or break a business, such as a restaurant. And then we come to capital goods, and capital goods we can define these as the produced materials made from labor, land, and other capital goods. Right? And again, this is what distinguishes us. This is how we've evolved over the centuries, just making more and more types of capital goods. Yes, humans, we've slightly changed, but Mother Nature is still the same. We've only changed Mother Nature through our own capital goods, but the capital goods is what really distinguishes us. Okay? And then we have technology, and we can define technology as the recipes that produce capital goods or consumer goods. Right? How do we actually make the sandwich, right? We could go online. We could figure out how to make a sandwich or something. How do we make a car? How do we make some sort of AI or whatever, right? We use technology. I want to talk about technology more because sometimes we think that technology is the main reason for economic growth. And it's certainly involved. We certainly see technology, but it's actually not the crucial factor of production involved in economic growth, right? There's something more fundamental, we could say, that allows technologies to be utilized. Okay, so some important notes, some things I want to clarify here. Austrian economists are big on calling land and labor the original factors of production. Right? Yes, we say that labor is produced, but again, it's produced in a different way. These land and labor, they originate from nature, we say, right? They are given, and it's really about how we decide, how entrepreneurs and how other individuals decide how to use land and labor, right? Different capital goods cannot be added together, right? You need money prices for that. We learned about this in the last lecture. Right? You can't just add goods in kind together. You can't add apples and oranges, right? So when we talk about capital goods and we think about the stock of capital goods that we have, or the stock of capital goods in our modern society, all the construction equipment, all the computers, all the electrical grids and so on, we can't add them together. We sometimes refer to that as capital, but we need to be very careful about that because you can't just simply add all the capital goods together and call it a blob, right? There's no common denominator. It's just things, right? You need money prices for that, right? So the capital value of a capital good is the money price of that good. You can add the capital value, right? The Mises Institute can compute the value of all of the capital goods it has, the computers, the PowerPoint projectors, all of its stuff only by adding the prices of those goods together, right? So it's important that we understand that, right? So that really relates to monetary calculation, and that's extremely crucial, as we've learned from the talk before me. Okay. Something else that's very important that bears emphasis is that factors of production differ in terms of their specificity. They are heterogeneous, right? So one capital good can't create everything, right? It not only we need other factors of production, but it can only create certain types of consumer goods, right? So some capital goods are more suited for certain tasks. Some capital goods are less suited for those tasks, right? A tractor can only do so many things. A PowerPoint projector can only do so many things. Certain types of, air conditioning facilities or machines or whatever. This is very, very important, right? And the entrepreneur is crucial in creating capital goods and figuring out, okay, I'm going to transform things, and it might be more serviceable for producing certain goods, but if those goods aren't valuable, well, I might have to suffer a loss because now I can't just simply quickly convert these capital goods into something else, right? So capital goods can be used to make a variety of goods, some more and some less, right? So we have this general understanding of capital goods and just, Austrian production theory. I want to obviously go through it in more depth here. So I want to start from the beginning, all right? I want to go through Crusoe economics, right? Based off the famous novel by Daniel Defoe. So let's focus on Crusoe. And for those of you who don't know Crusoe, right, but you should. Robinson Crusoe is stuck on a desert island with some supplies from a ship, and he's hungry, right? So we're now going to analyze the implications of this and what Crusoe can do. So I asked ChatGPT to generate a picture of Robinson Crusoe based on how I look, and I actually think it was quite good. I thought it did a great job. I used a picture from me from last year's pool party, actually. But so it's fairly accurate. My shoulders are a little bit bigger, but anyway, you can't be too critical. So Crusoe can satisfy his hunger by picking berries, right? And that's consumption. So he can just pick berries and he can eat them, and he can survive. Though he might need some protein powder but we'll say he can live on berries. And let's say that this takes 10 hours. Okay, it's a fairly meager existence, right? He could just simply be engaged in this production process, just eat berries for the rest of his life, and sort of eke out a very meager existence. But what he can also do is he can produce capital goods, right? He could produce a bow and arrow to hunt animals, right? He's going to want some protein, so he's going to have to go for some sort of animal, and he's going to need to produce a capital good, right? Let's say a bow and an arrow. So this is going to lead to more consumption, but the problem is it's going to take more time. It might take him 30 hours altogether to produce a good bow and arrow that can actually be used to reliably hunt animals and so on, right? And then, of course, there's a production process involved for actually turning the dead animal into some type of edible food. But let's just focus on the bow and arrow. So let's look at Crusoe's structure of production. Fortunately, Crusoe recovered a knife and twine from his ship, right? We're going to assume that there are 3 stages in the bow and arrow production structure. Right? You've got to gather the right wood and sticks. You've got to use the knife to sharpen the wood into a bow and sticks into arrows. And then you've got to add notches to the bow and tie twine to them, right? So it's a fairly simple process. Don't worry, we're not going to quiz you on how to make a bow and arrow, but we can say there's several stages and so on. So how can Crusoe make the bow and arrow and not starve, right? Well, what he's got to do is he's got to save. He's got to restrict his present consumption, right? And that restriction of present consumption will allow him to invest, right? Which is building capital goods. Savings and investment always go hand in hand, right? I can't go into this too much. You should know, hopefully from earlier today, this involves time preference. This is from Dr. Herbener's lecture. We have to figure out, all right, how much does Crusoe value present consumption versus future consumption, so on and so forth. But we just say, well, he's ready to make the sacrifice. He wants to enjoy a greater amount of consumption, more nutritious food, and so on. So let's say for 2 weeks, Crusoe reduces his consumption of berries and accumulates them, right? And so he's got a stockpile of berries, and then Crusoe is able to eat his berries while making his bow and arrow over, say, a 30-hour period or whatever, right? He makes his bow and arrow, and then finally, after producing his bow and arrow, Crusoe can finally increase his future consumption, all right? So he had to save, he had to restrict present consumption for a greater amount of future consumption. Very simple example, right? I don't assume any of you hopefully won't be stranded on a desert island anytime soon, but you all are actually engaged in very similar processes. You're weighing present consumption with future consumption, and then you're deciding, okay, I'm going to invest a certain amount or not, right? Okay, so we can say that Crusoe can grow his structure of production. Crusoe can continue to save berries to create more capital goods and further increase his future consumption, right? He could build, he could improve his bow, make it, shoot an arrow farther. He could add heads to arrows. He could build a net and a spear to catch fish, so on and so forth. Pretty soon, he'll have a nice little pad. It's right there. He's got a hammock. He's got sorts of other stuff. He's living life, right? But of course, in order to do this, it's going to take time, right? Investment always takes time, right? And as Crusoe's investing, he's building more and more capital goods. He's got to maintain those capital goods, so on and so forth. He's going to add more stages of production, and he's going to lengthen his structure of production, right? Or really his structures of production, right? If he wants to build a better bow, right, it's going to take him more time to build a bow, say 50 hours or something like that. If he's also got to keep his house in order to prevent the roof from falling or something like that, he's going to have to devote time to doing these things, okay? He's postponing consumption now for a greater amount of future consumption. Okay, so the more productive structures, right, i.e. those that lead to greater increases in consumption, take more time and have more stages, right? There's more and more higher order goods that are involved, right? These are what Bombewerk called roundabout production processes, right? Time preferences are the ultimate limit on roundaboutness, right? They're the reason why we don't always just adopt the longest production process. It might lead to a greater amount of consumption, but we say, well, look, I got to eat now, or I want to spend some time, and what about a little me time, right? That's what I usually say a lot of times at the end of my day. But we'd say, well, our balancing of present consumption and future consumption, that's the ultimate limit on roundaboutness, right? That's the ultimate limit that prevents us from adopting the longer production processes. But as time preferences fall, we adopt those longer production processes, right? As individuals save and adopt more roundabout production processes, human civilization advances. The total structure of production, which I'm going to talk about now, gets longer and longer, right? This is what distinguishes us from 50 years ago, 100 years ago, so on and so forth. Now, a very important point that I want to emphasize is that when we're talking about a roundabout production process, we're not just focusing on the last stage. Because you might be thinking, well, wait a second, isn't it true that it takes less time to do things? Right? You might get in a plane and you can fly from New York City to California or Los Angeles in a couple hours. Right? That certainly takes a lot less time than, going, on the Oregon Trail, in a pony or in a wagon or something like that. Well, we have to be looking at the overall structure, not just the last stage, but all the stages. All the capital goods involved in building that airplane, right? That takes more time, right, and is more involved than, say, traveling, on a horse or in a car across the country. Okay. All right, so here we are. So let's look at the modern economy, right? Capital goods are produced by different individuals and they are exchanged for money. I'm going to talk about these types of individuals in a little bit, known as capitalists, right? But we live in in this type of complex society. One person just isn't making all the capital goods. It's multiple people, right? Okay, and they're going to sell them to someone else, right, for money. So let's look at the structure of production for steel rails, right? Let's say we're looking at the first stage. Right? It can be a little confusing because that first stage or the earliest stage is where the highest order goods are producing. So the numbers are a little flipped here, but it's just through greater understanding and practice we'll get it. So the first stage is mining ore, coal and limestone. You got to remove topsoil and rock. You got to drill and blast. You got to do all sorts of stuff like that. Then you got to smelt ore into iron. So you got to heat the ore at high temperatures to extract the iron, okay? Then you got to refine the iron into steel. Okay, so you have to remove the impurities. You have to add some sort of alloy. It's usually done in a blast furnace, right? Mises Institute has one in another room if you want to see it. But no. Then you got to shape the steel into rails, right? There's got to be some sort of heating and bending process involved, molding it into a specific shape. And then the final stage is, let's say you got to lay those rails to make a railroad, or at least the tracks for that railroad, right? So you got to lay down gravel, you got to add wooden railroad ties, and then you add the steel rails that are fastened with steel plates, something like that, right? So various stages of capital goods being produced, and at each stage we'll say the capitalist is selling, or someone is selling it to another producer. All right. So I've been mentioning this capitalist. Let's look at him a little bit more. Who are these people? All right, at each stage of the rail-making process, capitalists save money and invest. Right? Have you guys ever played Monopoly? Right, this is the Monopoly man. He's a capitalist. Right? Really, just a capitalist is just anyone who saves. So some of you are capitalists. If you own stock or if you run a small business or something like that, you're a capitalist. You don't have to be a wealthy robber baron or a billionaire to be a capitalist. So capitalists have lower time preferences than their workers because they are willing to postpone present consumption. They're willing to pay their workers now to have them produce a good so then they can sell that good in the future and make more money, right? And in doing so, right, they're going to earn interest, as we'll talk about. So a capitalist is going to purchase factors of production to create more capital goods that they will sell, right? And in return for their savings, in return for this, they are going to earn interest, right? So capitalists could spend $100 on buying capital goods produced by another capitalist, by hiring some labor, purchasing some natural resources, and so on. And then they're going to sell it in the future for $105, right? And they're going to earn 5% interest. We'll say. We're not going to talk about profit and loss. That involves entrepreneurship, which Dr. Klein mentioned yesterday, and so on. But profit could be mixed in with that. But we're just going to say, well, this is going to be interest. Okay. So capitalists are indispensable. Right? They're not just greedy. They're not greedy, blood-sucking people that aren't performing any service. They're the savers. If you don't have savings, you don't have any of this. Right? You don't have any nice technology, any air conditioning, any advanced civilization. You got none of it. Right? We're back into Robinson Crusoe's world. Okay, so when we look at the overall structure of production, right, we could say there's various structures of production to produce certain goods, but we're just saying, well, let's try to look at the economy overall. Right? Austrians are not big with aggregates, right? But we do sometimes take a larger, a broader view of the economy. Right? And we could say that, well, we can, for simplicity's sake, we can break down the economy into 5 stages. Right? You've got mining and harvesting, raw materials, right? Whether that's some sort of crop harvested or whether it's something dug out of the ground or something like that. This is the first stage, right? You have refining. Okay, where you're taking those raw materials and you're doing something to them. They can become some sort of input, right? So you've got iron ore, and then you're turning that iron ore into iron, right? Or you've got wheat, and you're turning that wheat into flour, or something like that. You're threshing the wheat. And then you've got manufacturing, right? Where you're taking these, sorts of refined raw materials and the refined goods, and you're making something in a factory, right? You might be making an iPhone or something like that. Then you've got packaging and distributing the goods, sort of the wholesale level, we could say, right? You might have to put some wrapping paper on it. You got to design the fancy cover or whatever. And then you've got preparing consumer goods for them to be sold to the consumer, right? So you can roughly break down the structure of production to make an iPhone or a laptop into these 5 stages. And of course, it's very complicated because we got to look at technically the structure of production to make the machines that are used to make the iPhones and so on and so forth. It can get very, very complicated. But we know that it exists, right? Because we know that we get the goods. The goods exist. So Austrians are big on using diagrams that look something like this. You could spend 45 minutes just looking at a diagram like this. I want to just kind of cover it sort of briefly. So you have this beautiful trapezoid, I might add. And we have, it's sometimes they're known as Hayekian triangles. They're technically trapezoids, but you've got these stages. So the gray bars represent the money that's spent or the money that's earned. So say in the first stage, right, the capitalist is, say, hiring some workers to mine iron or whatever. They have to pay the landowner or the mine owner. They might be, we'll just say they could be purchasing some capital goods, obviously digging equipment and so on, right? And then they sell it to a later capitalist, right? They spend the first gray bar, and then they earn the revenue. So the slightly larger gray bar next to it, right? And that black line, that's the interest they earn, right? So we go from the first stage to the second stage, right? So then what happens at the second stage, the refining stage? Well, that capitalist had purchased the prior made capital good. They also hire some workers and they buy some natural resources, and then they're going to refine those raw materials, right? And then they sell it to the manufacturer, right? And so on and so forth, right? So at each stage, the revenue earned is greater than before, right? Because no capitalist is going to willingly sell something for less money than what they had to spend. That would say that would violate time preference. And this will continue until we get to the last stage when the consumer good is sold to the consumer, right? And then the consumer enjoys it, and this could be an iPhone. This could be the ham sandwich, whatever, right? But the structure of production exists for all goods, right? And we can use something like this to describe the structure of production for the entire economy. Okay. All right. So just a couple things I want to note about this overall structure of production. A couple of terms Austrians have used to describe it. So we've mentioned higher orders, and I want to return to that. But I want to talk a little bit about what's known as the lower orders. So the lower order stages are those stages that lead to consumer goods in the near future. So that could be like the 4th stage, say, the wholesale level, or the 5th stage, preparing the consumer goods for sale. They lead to consumer goods in the near future, right? It might be a couple of months, it might be a year or whatever, right? But these are the lower orders. The higher orders, or the higher order stages, are those stages that lead to consumer goods in the remote future. Say, when you're harvesting iron ore out of the ground, it might be a very long time before that is turned into steel that will eventually be used for some sort of car frame or whatever, right? If you're developing the computer chips, or they will be used to make some power a data center that will then be used to make bigger computer chips for artificial intelligence, right? It could be a long time for that. So we have the lower orders and we have the higher orders. Sometimes the lower orders are called the later stages. Sometimes the higher orders are called the earlier stages, right? These are relative. There's not a sign you go into a business and it's like, welcome. Well, you're in the lower orders right now, right? Or you're in the higher orders. This is just something Austrian economists use to try to distinguish different stages of production from one another. Okay, so whenever you're investing, you're really just creating more and more higher order goods, more and more higher order stages. You're just simply adding on to the production process. The structure of production is becoming more roundabout, as we're going to discuss, right? More higher orders means a greater payoff. You're going to be able to produce more consumer goods or better quality consumer goods, right? That would make people happier. That's an advancement in living standards. The problem, though, is that also means more waiting, right? And this is the eternal sort of conflict between consumption and investment, right? We all have to consult our time preferences for what we want to do. This is why people don't just simply squirrel away their entire income and put it in a retirement account. Because yeah, you could have a lot of money in 50 years, but if you're going to be miserable during those 50 years, you're probably going to think, well, it's not going to be worth it, right? Okay. So as we kind of wrap up, I want to talk a little bit about changes in the structure of production, right? In that diagram that we had just looked at. So capitalists increasing their savings is the main reason for economic growth, right? It's actually not technology, because you could have technology, you could have some sort of sophisticated blueprint to make an electric car or a self-driverless car or some sort of computer chip you can put in someone's brain or whatever. But if you don't have the savings, if you don't have the capital goods, then it's just on a piece of paper, right? Or it's just in some sort of secure file, on a computer, right? It's not actually going to be turned into something, right? So in order to have economic growth, you have to have capitalists save, right? And that could be ordinary people like ourselves, or it could be really rich billionaires. So as capitalists save, this leads to additional higher order stages, and that lengthens the structure of production. I want to show this on the next slide, okay? So creating more and more stages and having a longer structure of production, this is going to lead to more consumer goods, right? And this is going to lead to better quality consumer goods. And we've all benefited from this, right? You guys have grown up in the era of the smartphone, right? But back in my day, you had the flip phone, right? You couldn't just text easy. You had T9 Word, right? You didn't have all these games. You had Snake on your phone, right? It was tough, right? But I got through. I turned out all right, right? But you only got those better phones because people were investing in Apple. People were buying stock in Apple. People were lending Apple money and so on, right? So you need to have savings in order to have those better quality goods. And if you want to keep having better quality goods, you got to keep having savings. Okay, so let's look at the structure of production. This is basically the same diagram I have from before. I've just put down and replaced those numbers with higher order and lower order. Just, again, it's relative. Right? Relative, we're all friends here. All right, so you have this structure of production, all right? And so let's say people save. Let's say people reduce the amount they spend on consumer goods, and they're going to save it, and it's going to be invested. Again, we could spend a lot of time talking about this, only have so much time, but what basically happens is the structure of production changes, right? So the red is the new structure of production, and the gray is the old one. So consumption spending goes down, and the money that's earned in those lower orders goes down. At the same time, more money is invested in the higher orders, and new stages are created, so the amount of money put in those higher orders goes up, right? So the overall result is that the slope of the trapezoid actually sort of flattens out. And that reflects the lower interest rate. That is the lower interest rate. People have lower time preferences, so they have a lower premium on present consumption, right? And that is going to lead to a lower interest rate. So if people are saving more, they're spending less on consumption now, they're going to devote more resources to producing capital goods. And what's going to happen as time goes on is those capital goods are going to lead to more consumer goods. And people will be able to consume more, even though they're actually spending less on consumption, because the prices of those goods have gone down, right? The price of a laptop isn't nearly as much as what it used to be, a quarter of a century ago. You wanted to buy a laptop, and could be like $2,000. You could still get a $2,000 laptop, but it's going to be a lot better quality than what you could get in the year 2000. You could get a much cheaper laptop for $500, $600 that can do a lot more. Right? That's the result of a more roundabout structure of production. That's the result of people saving more. Okay. So this is what Austrians really emphasize, okay? It's over time, the structure of production becomes more narrow, it stretches out, more stages are created. It's because of this that we have something like artificial intelligence, or we might have driverless cars or something like that, right? Of course, if people didn't save, the exact opposite would happen. We'd go from the red to the gray, and we would become poorer as a result, right? We would be able to produce less consumer goods, and they would all cost more. Okay, so sort of finishing up here, what's the significance of Austrian capital theory, right? Well, the first thing is, as I mentioned before, capital goods are heterogeneous, right? The structure of production is what Austrians call a lattice work of capital goods. It's not a blob. It's better to think of capital goods as like a puzzle. They all fit together. And the task of the entrepreneur is to combine capital goods with other capital goods to produce either a capital good or a consumer good that people value, right? So this lattice work, this structure, this puzzle is constantly changing, right? In neoclassical economics, we often learn about how we just sort of think of the structure, we don't even really think of the structure of production. We just think of production as a blob. It's, well, you've got capital, you've got labor, and they can all do the same thing. And don't think about it anymore, right? And this is usually how it's described for simplicity's sake, but that comes at a serious loss in realism, right? We also learned that time is a crucial part of any production process, right? Production is not instantaneous. Time is involved in every action, right? And every action could be thought of as production, right? If you want to make anything, there's got to be time involved, right? We can get confused into thinking that, well, production, looks like it doesn't take any time, but it's absolutely not true. That's from being misled by a general equilibrium model that we don't need to get into. But this often can confuse many economists, right? And savings, not technology, is the most important ingredient for economic growth, right? If you want to, if you want to expand the structure of production, right? If you want to produce more types of consumer goods, more consumer goods, you of course need technology. A lot of businesses invest in research and development, right? But in order to do that, you need savings, right? So just having the technological recipe for something isn't actually going to lead to economic growth, because if that were the case, then you would need, you could just simply drop blueprints for driverless cars to various, developing countries, and you could say, here you go, right? Prosper. That's not the case, right? Now, of course, we could take a step back further and we could say, well, what leads to savings? And ultimately, that's what's known as institutions, or the rules governing exchange, things like private property and so on. People are only going to save if they think that the government's not going to confiscate their money, or if someone steals from them, they will be able to get recourse through some sort of insurance company or court system or so on, right? But Austrians stress savings, right? Savings are what's really crucial. Okay. So I think I actually have a couple of minutes. So thanks for listening. For those of you who are interested in this, I highly encourage you to read Man, Economy, and State with Power and Market. See everyone again in the afternoon. And I guess I have a question, time for a question. Let's see. So yes. Yeah. So should we?
Okay, you have a question? Okay. Very concise. I have that. I have the book. Is that on? I have the book, Man, Economy and State. How advice would you give me to approach the book? I read The Study Guide by Robert Murphy. Mm-hmm. So, in your own opinion, what do you think is best to approach the book? Or?
Yeah. So that's a great question. I mean, so Man, Economy, and State is a tough book. This book is like 1,500 pages, right? So it's the full thing. It's very tough. So I definitely say, listen to read the study guide, because that has this sort of separate descriptions of each of the chapters. There's also several lectures online, sometimes audio lectures of various scholars at the Institute. You can find them. I think it's the RGS lectures from Rothbard Graduate Seminar lectures from 2008, going through each chapter. Those are online. I listened to those when I was really, when I first read this book, and that really helped. So don't get intimidated by it. Man, Economy, and State and Human Action are large books, but there are smaller books to read. Just like there's Human Action, there's also Bob Murphy's Study Guide to Human Action. There's also Bob Murphy wrote a book, Choice, covering sort of human action, a smaller version that you can that you should also read. So yeah, there's tons of resources on Man, Economy, and State. Do we have one?
Take my prerogative here
yeah.
and ask a question of my own. What would you say is more fundamental to determining the length of production? Would you say it's time preference, the disutility of waiting, or would you say it's the interest rate, like how profitable a certain structure of production can be?
Well, they're both kind of saying the same thing, right? Because the interest rate's determined by time preference, right? So it's the break, the deciding whether or not something is profitable to embark upon. Really, the strict definition of profit is a return that's greater than the interest rate, right? And that interest rate's determined by time preference. So it's really the ultimate limit on determining whether or not something is profitable, should be embarked upon is time preference, right? And of course, you have to forecast the future to figure out if is what you think going to be valued in the future. But yeah, it's a great question. Okay, so I think we're done. So see everyone in the afternoon, and you're free for lunch. So, yay. All right.